Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Alaska del Sur wash processed Ecuador from Kawa Coffee. And there's the bag right there. And Kawa, based out of Paris, France. And they're a coffee roaster that's appeared on this channel on numerous occasions. However, this will be our last time reviewing them as they have recently rebranded to the name Tanat, and I have no idea why they made that change, but as a result, this is our last time reviewing them under the name Kawa. We picked this coffee up from Airworks as part of their special People Possession and Kawa release. And when I found out Airworks was going to be bringing in Kawa, it gave me an opportunity to look through their website as they do have a pretty extensive catalog of coffees. And of all of their offerings, this is the one that I was most interested in, and that was for two reasons. First of which being that it is a Mejorado coffee, but the second reason being that it is an Alaska del Sur coffee, which is a coffee that we've reviewed from a couple of roasters in the past, including the Picky Chemist and George Howell. As some people might remember that just a couple of years ago, it was the Alaska del Sur Mejorado that finished highest in the Ecuadorian Cup of Excellence as far as Mejorado coffees go. So any opportunity we get to review this coffee is one that I will happily take. So I'm looking forward to discussing it, as this right here is day 51. And recipe we went with for this coffee was a slightly lower extraction one at a 15:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 95 degrees Celsius, about 203 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this coffee. Interestingly enough, once upon a time, I believe that they used to have their coffees labeled as either filter, omni roast, or espresso roast. This one isn't labeled as any of the above, but I do believe it might have been under their filter category. That being said, it does feel pretty much on par with the majority of experiences we have had with this coffee roaster, which we've described in our most recent People Possession review as being not quite as light as a lot of their other Parisian contemporaries like the Substance or Datura. But outside of that, they are still a bit lighter than the majority of European-based coffee roasters. Again, the description that Airworks had was that they're a little lighter than some of the Nordic-based coffee roasters these days, which is something I can definitely see, at least when it came to this coffee as well. Not necessarily the lightest coffee out there, but still a little bit more on that moderately light side of things by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 23, first impression through the V60, and the coffee was a slight bit more tame than initially expected, as it's offering a slightly more generic feel with an emphasis on the darker tea attributes and some slight citric qualities. In addition to that, there's a very slight tomato-like component within the cool down itself, so it was an okay first impression. And as far as these Alaska del Sur coffees have gone in the past, the one from George Howell was pretty interesting. I think that's the only one that technically did score highest on that Ecuadorian Cup of Excellence that we did review. I don't quite recall whether or not this one or the Picky Chemist's version were the same year's harvest, so I think for that reason that one offered just something slightly different. But even then, it did have a little bit more of that interesting, it was a kind of minty herbal quality to it, but having a little bit more of that vegetal quality in this coffee early on was just a little bit more interesting, as I can kind of see that from some of the Alaska del Sur coffees we have had in the past, including the Sidra that we had from Identity Coffee Lab. Day 26 through the Chemex, and there's a similar second impression to this coffee, as it's a slightly more generic feel with a bit more of the sweetness being presented in a tame and subdued sense, especially for a Mejorado coffee, as there's more of a focus on the savory and citric aspects of this coffee and more of that previously mentioned tomato. And I was kind of surprised that we're continuing to get that tomato-like characteristic to it, but that's something that we'll continue to work through as we progress with this coffee. On day 29, through the April brewer, and the coffee was the best it had been by a distance, as it's acting much more in line with the expectations for a Mejorado, with greater sweetness and intensity, especially within the sugary sense. Slightly herbal, but more of the savory tomato aspect has dissipated altogether, leading to much better results. And I've said in the past that with some of the Mejorado coffees we have had in the past, especially the ones that come out a little bit more tomato-like, they do find themselves to be at their best when the extraction is lowered ever so slightly, because I think it just kind of dissipates that specific quality and allows for a greater focus on those sugary sweet aspects of these coffees, and that seems to be the case with this one, though there are certainly a number of Mejorado coffees that we have pushed to do much better results. Day 32 through the V60 with Kawa's recipe, which is a very strange one. It's a 14.2:1 at 95 degrees Celsius. And I mentioned in our recent People Possession review that it's so strange that this recipe and the one that they have for People Possession is so different. But the coffee is the best that it had been to this point, as it's the sweetest and most defined it has been, with more of a darker, sugary stone fruit quality that's in line with the listed plum. And truth be told, up to this moment, I was kind of wondering where they got that plum note for this coffee, mostly because it really didn't seem to resemble anything even somewhat close to a stone fruit quality. So this time I can see a lot more of that. Savoriness is presenting itself much more in a tea-like sense as opposed to the tomato-like characteristics, so I was much happier with the experience this time around. Day 35, do the Chemex with, I guess it's Kawa's recipe, getting sidetracked between Kawa and people possession. And the coffee is a little less intense overall and pronounced compared to some of the previous days, as the savory tea characteristics are pretty direct once again. And I think it's kind of funny that with both this coffee and the people possession coffee, they really didn't seem to perform very well with the Chemex. Still not as sweet as expected for a Mejorado, with the majority of the sweetness coming through as the coffee does cool down, so more mixed impressions with this coffee on this day with this brew method. Day 38 through the V60 with our standard recipe, and there are mixed results, as I really wondered if just pushing this coffee back to where we had it to begin with was really going to hinder it as much as it did, or if this coffee just seemed to improve with time. But it felt like anytime we did push this coffee ever so slightly, more of the tomato-like characteristics came out, as it's present yet again. So it's consistent when the coffee is brewed at slightly higher temperatures or a slightly lower concentration, but otherwise it's more reminiscent to the black tea characteristics with the complementary citric qualities. So for that reason, I don't think we could really push this coffee too much. Day 41, do the Chemex with our standard recipe, and the coffee does continue to demonstrate a relatively pronounced tomato-like characteristic and an abundance of overall savoriness to it. So less impressive results with the Chemex once again, as there are some sugary qualities in the finish, but it still does demonstrate more of these savory qualities once the coffee is pushed. So on day 44, back through the V60 with some lower extraction adjustments at a 15-1 at 95 Celsius, and the coffee was the best it had been to this moment. Toning down a lot of those savory tomato-like characteristics, presenting in a much more black tea-like sense, especially off brew, before cooling down into a much better experience with some dark berry aspects. I think they have a prune note listed on here, but that's the best descriptor I had for that. Also more of the citrus and a very rich plum-like quality. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have a handful of level 4s, so let's go through those. We'll start with the cleanliness level 4. Even though at times it was slightly hindered by that tomato-like quality, especially towards the end, we were able to get the best of this coffee in a much more clean and well-defined sense, and for that reason, I'm very happy to score it there at that level 4 mark, as it was very representative of what you would hope for a wash-processed Mejorado coffee in terms of the cleanliness. Finish level 4. Finish a little bit more presented in both a tea-like sense. Chamomile is one of the notes they have listed on here, makes a lot of sense. But outside of that, a little bit of those sugary Mejorado-like qualities to it. It's a lot more of those savory qualities for me, though, within this finish. It's presenting itself in one of two ways, either the tomato notes that we got on certain days or the more tea-like qualities of it. So level 4, where we opted to put that. Sweetness, level 4. I will be completely honest with this one. I'm very happy that it reached that level 4, because there were times, especially the first couple of times we brewed it, where I did have some pretty heavy concerns that it wasn't going to score that level 4 mark. I've heard some people in the past describe Mejorado coffees as being reminiscent of very weak tea. And with a coffee like this, on certain days, I saw exactly what they were saying. I don't usually get that from the majority of Mejorado coffees we've worked with. There has been an exception here or there, but for the most part, I don't necessarily see that. But with this coffee, I could see that on certain days. Towards the end, though, got enough sweetness to justify that level 4 mark, which was a relief given that that wasn't always the case. Acidity, level 4. I do have some issues with that. As I was brewing this last coffee, I said it's probably closer to the level 3 mark. I think maybe when we were brewing this coffee, it just seemed to offer a little bit more brightness than I was necessarily expecting, but I think that might be slightly mislabeled, as I feel like level 3 is probably a better representation of that. Stone fruit, level 4. I am very happy that I was able to get some really nice definition to the plum, and I do have to say that there are certain days where it's all the way down there at level 2. I wasn't getting enough of those stone fruit characteristics to really justify that level 4 mark, but for whatever reason, just lowering the extraction ever so slightly in this coffee seemed to really accentuate a lot of those qualities to the point where it was pretty well defined and pretty blatant, transparent, about as obvious as possible within this coffee, especially relative to a lot of the notes we received from this coffee. So level 4 definitely justified with a little bit of tinkering and adjustments on it. Then we have a handful of level 3s. We will start with the florality level 3. It does have that slight Mejorado floral characteristic to it. I often describe it as being honey-like or honeysuckle-like, and it's not quite as abundant as some of the other characteristics in this coffee, but justified enough to keep it a little bit higher in that regard. Berry fruit level 3. I mentioned there are some darker berry components to it, and that was a pretty consistent quality within this coffee throughout the entirety of it, even if it wasn't maybe anywhere near as high as some of the other more savory dominant components within this one. Citrus fruit level 3. I don't have anything really descriptive as far as the citric qualities go. It's a little bit more of that generic citric feel to it that did give this coffee a little bit of depth as well, but don't necessarily have too much to add to that. Can't quite recall whether or not any of the other Alaska del Surs did seem to focus on the more citric-like qualities of these coffees, but level 3 where we opted to put it nonetheless. Savoriness level 3, a lot of tea-like characteristics to it. And again, as soon as I saw that chamomile note, I did scratch my head a little bit and said, that's not too common for the majority of Mejorado coffees we've had in the past, but with this one, it was as straightforward as possible and by far the most dominant characteristic of this coffee. So level 3 where we opted to put that. And then the final thing worth discussing, we have the body there at the level 3 mark. I've said in the past that the two things with Mejorado coffees do tend to fluctuate a lot, and that's body between 2 and 3, and that's going to be brightness between 3 and a 4. If I remember correctly, I think that their own description of this coffee said that it was a little bit more medium bodied and that the acidity was pretty low, but I don't know if I could necessarily say that the acidity was low relative to some of the coffees we've had in the past, but level 3 I think is probably ideal for both, as they both seem to kind of fall into that range a little bit more closely than lower level body and higher level acidity. So as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I'll start with this. The coffee that I can compare it to the most is the one that we had from the Biggie Chemist, their Alaska del Sur. And I feel like I had a pretty strong preference towards that coffee, mostly because I did appreciate the sweetness that was coming from it a little bit more, and it also seemed to be void of any of the very strong savory characteristics that were present within this coffee. And this coffee was a little bit sensitive, as the fact that we could just kind of lower the extraction on this one ever so slightly, and we saw such a drastic change in terms of the way that this coffee presented itself is a little interesting to me. So not entirely sure what to make of that, but at the end of the day, this is probably my favorite Kawa coffee that we've ever had, which is kind of fitting given that it's our last ever Kawa review. It's pretty close to that Mosto processed Ethiopian coffee that we reviewed from them, which is ironically the first coffee that we ever reviewed from them. And up to this moment was my favorite coffee that we had from Kawa. So start out with one of my favorites and with one of my favorites, and the fact that every coffee that we had in between I had very mixed feelings on is just kind of funny when you think about it. The type of person I would suggest this coffee to: Alaska del Sur Mejorados do seem to be just a little bit different from a lot of the other Mejorado coffees that I have had, as they just, for whatever reason, seem to offer that slightly more vegetal, kind of garden-like feel to them. I mentioned in the past that they've either had a little bit more of those vegetal or savory or those herbal components to them, as opposed to Mejorados that seem to be much more sugary sweet and sugary direct. So that's kind of interesting to me as a starting point. Outside of that, this one's extremely tea forward, so if you like your tea forward coffees that do tend to have a little bit more sweetness, I also feel like this one might be a pretty good fit. That's kind of the best direction I can point somebody towards on this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it, as well as I've actually heard a ridiculous amount of positive feedback on this coffee, so it sounds like a lot of people really enjoyed this coffee. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Alaska del Sur wash processed Ecuador from Kawa Coffee. Thank you for watching.